was a night I'll never forget. The clock had just struck midnight, and I found myself boarding a near-empty train. The air was heavy, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes you shiver for no reason. Outside, the world was pitch black. No stars, no moon, just the faint flicker of streetlights far in the distance. I didn't know it then, but that ride was going to change everything I thought I knew about reality. Something was off, subtle, but undeniable. As the train doors closed behind me with a hiss, I felt it, a chill that crawled up my spine, the kind of chill that whispers, "You shouldn't be here." Oh, and before we dive into what happened next, make sure to subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what's coming. As the train rattled through the night, the silence inside felt almost suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. There were only a few passengers scattered around. A man in a tattered coat muttering under his breath, a woman clutching her bag tightly, and an elderly gentleman staring intently out the window as if searching for something in the darkness. The overhead lights flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls. I tried to focus on the sound of the wheels clattering against the tracks, hoping it would calm my nerves. But then, something caught my attention. A faint tapping sound coming from the seat behind me. I turned to look, but no one was there. The seat was completely empty. A shiver ran down my spine, and I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, it was late, and I was probably just tired. I glanced back toward the other passengers. The man in the tattered coat was no longer muttering, but staring straight ahead, completely still. The woman with the bag seemed even more tense, her knuckles white as she gripped it tightly. And the elderly gentleman, he was no longer looking out the window. Instead, he was staring directly at me. His gaze was cold, almost piercing, and for a moment, I couldn't look away. I tried to smile, but he didn't react. He just kept staring, unblinking. My heart began to race as I quickly turned back around and stared out the window. The darkness outside felt endless, but at least it wasn't as unnerving as the people around me. Then, the train lights flickered again, and this time they stayed off for a few seconds. In the brief moment of darkness, I swear I heard something. A faint whisper just behind my ear. It wasn't in a language I could understand, but the tone was clear. It sounded wrong. When the lights came back on, I looked around in a panic. No one else seemed to notice anything. The other passengers sat as they were before, as if nothing had happened. But I knew something wasn't right on this train, and I wasn't sure if I was going to make it to my destination. The train rattled on, each sound sharper, more intense than before. My nerves were on edge, and every flicker of light or unexpected noise made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. As I glanced around, I noticed the man in the tattered coat wasn't in his seat anymore. He was gone, just like that, without a trace. I scanned the carriage, but there was no sign of him. The woman with the bag was still there, but her head was bowed so low I couldn't see her face. Her shoulders were trembling slightly, like she was silently crying or laughing. Then there was the elderly man. He was still staring at me. Only now there was a strange, unsettling grin on his face. It wasn't a smile of warmth or friendliness. It was cold, unnerving, almost predatory. The train's lights flickered again, this time longer. The carriage plunged into complete darkness for what felt like an eternity. I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick, mixing with the rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks. And then I heard it, a whisper, low, guttural, and disturbingly close. "Do you know where this train is headed?" My heart nearly stopped. The voice didn't sound like it came from any of the passengers. It was too close, right next to my ear. I whipped my head around, but there was no one there. The lights flickered back on, and the elderly man was no longer in his seat. Instead, he was standing just a few feet away from me, his grin wider than before. His eyes were glassy, as if they weren't even real. Before I could react, the train jolted violently, throwing me forward in my seat. The overhead luggage rattled, and I heard a loud, piercing scream. It came from the woman with the bag. She was pointing at something down the aisle, her face pale with terror. I turned to look and froze. At the far end of the carriage, a figure was standing. It was shrouded in shadows, its form tall and impossibly thin, with glowing, hollow eyes. It began to move slowly, deliberately, down the aisle toward us. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, but the train jolted again, harder this time, knocking me back into my seat. The lights flickered wildly, and the figure seemed to disappear and reappear with every flash. And then, it was gone. The train went completely silent. No clatter of the wheels, no hum of the engine, nothing. The passengers were still, like statues. Even the air felt heavy and lifeless. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then, I heard it again, that same whisper. But this time, it was everywhere. "Do you know where this train is going?" The train came to a sudden stop, throwing me forward in my seat. I sat up, gasping for air, and looked around. The lights were dim, barely illuminating the carriage, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the faint creak of the train settling on the tracks. The figure was gone. So were the passengers. Every seat, once filled with eerie strangers, was now completely empty. My heart raced as I stood up, clutching the edge of my seat for balance. I moved toward the door, desperate to escape, but the train wasn't at a station. Outside, there was only darkness, an endless void stretching in all directions. I banged on the doors, shouting, "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed unnaturally, as if the sound was being swallowed by the void itself. Then I heard it again. "Do you know where this train is going?" The voice came from behind me. Slowly, I turned, dreading what I might see. The elderly man was standing at the other end of the carriage, his grin even wider now, his eyes gleaming with something inhuman. "This train doesn't stop for the living," he said, his voice cold and hollow. Panic surged through me, and I backed away, pressing myself against the door. Suddenly, the train jolted again, and the lights went out completely. I felt the floor beneath me give way, as if the train itself was dissolving into nothingness. When I woke up, I was lying on the platform of a deserted station. The air was still and silent, and the train was nowhere in sight. My watch had stopped at midnight, and my phone showed no signal. I stumbled out of the station, my legs weak, my mind reeling. To this day, I don't know what happened on that train. Was it a dream, a hallucination, or something far more sinister? All I know is I never saw those passengers or that train ever again. And now, every time I hear a train whistle at night, I can't help but wonder, was it calling for me? I never spoke about that night to anyone. Who would believe me? Even now, years later, the memory feels like a foggy dream, a nightmare I can't wake up from. But there's one thing I can't forget: the voice. Do you know where this train is going? Sometimes I hear it in my sleep, echoing in the dark corners of my mind, and every so often I catch myself staring at the tracks when I hear a train passing late at night. I wonder if that train is out there, still running through the endless darkness, collecting passengers who don't realize what they've boarded. Was I lucky to escape, or was I meant to stay? Perhaps someday I'll find out. Until then, I'll avoid midnight trains. But if you ever find yourself stepping onto an empty carriage at night, listen carefully. If you hear the whisper, it's already too late.
I banged on the doors, shouting, "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed unnaturally, as if the sound was being swallowed by the void itself. Then, I heard it again. "Do you know where this train is going?" The voice came from behind me. Slowly, I turned, dreading what I might see. The elderly man was standing at the other end of the carriage, his grin even wider now, his eyes gleaming with something inhuman. "This train doesn't stop for the living," he said, his voice cold and hollow. Panic surged through me, and I backed away, pressing myself against the door. Suddenly, the train jolted again, and the lights went out completely. I felt the floor beneath me give way, as if the train itself was dissolving into nothingness. When I woke up, I was lying on the platform of a deserted station. The air was still and silent, and the train was nowhere in sight. My watch had stopped at midnight, and my phone showed no signal. I stumbled out of the station, my legs weak, my mind reeling. To this day, I don't know what happened on that train. Was it a dream, a hallucination, or something far more sinister? All I know is I never saw those passengers or that train ever again. And now, every time I hear a train whistle at night, I can't help but wonder. Was it calling for me? I never spoke about that night to anyone. Who would believe me? Even now, years later, the memory feels like a foggy dream, a nightmare I can't wake up from. But there's one thing I can't forget. The voice. Do you know where this train is going? Sometimes I hear it in my sleep, echoing in the dark corners of my mind. And every so often I catch myself staring at the tracks when I hear a train passing late at night. I wonder if that train is out there, still running through the endless darkness, collecting passengers who don't realize what they've boarded. Was I lucky to escape? Or was I meant to stay? Perhaps someday I'll find out. Until then, I'll avoid midnight trains. But if you ever find yourself stepping onto an empty carriage at night, listen carefully. If you hear the whisper, it's already too late. The lights above flickered again, casting shadows across the train. For a brief moment, the figure seemed to blur, his form stretching unnaturally. My vision wavered as if something was leaking through the edges of reality. I glanced around. No one else seemed to notice what was happening. The figure stopped just a few feet away, his eyes locked onto mine. He tilted his head slightly, a cold smile playing on his lips. "You're not like the others, are you?" My stomach churned. "Who? What are you?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaking. But he didn't answer. Instead, the train jolted slightly, lurching forward, and the lights went out completely for a second. In the pitch-black darkness, I felt something watching from just behind me. A presence, close enough to hear breathing. The lights flickered back on, and the figure was gone. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. The silence in the train was deafening now. I looked around once more, but everything seemed normal, except for the cold dread settling in my chest. What had I just encountered? And where was this train really going? The train continued to move, but the atmosphere inside had shifted. The quiet hum of the wheels became louder in my ears, almost suffocating. My breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me, watching. The lights flickered again, this time longer, As they went out, the carriage plunged into complete darkness. A chill ran through me, and I felt the sudden weight of eyes on me once more. I spun around, but there was nothing behind me, only shadows stretching endlessly into the darkness. Then I heard it again, a whisper, low and cold, right in my ear. "Do you know where this train is going?" My heart pounded as I whipped my head around, but the carriage was empty. Just rows of silent seats and the still, oppressive air. Yet I could feel it. The presence was near. I glanced back toward the other passengers. They hadn't moved, still sitting motionless. But now I noticed something strange. Every single one of them had their heads turned slightly toward me, as if listening. And that's when I saw him again. At the far end of the carriage, the shadowy figure was back. His hollow eyes gleamed faintly in the dim light. Slowly, he began moving toward me, his form bending unnaturally, as though he didn't quite belong in this space. The air around him felt heavy, suffocating. The train jolted again, harder this time, shaking the floor beneath me. The lights flickered wildly, on and off, blinking as though the darkness was fighting to consume everything. I tried to back away, but my body felt frozen. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure's presence grew stronger with every step. He wasn't human. There was something far older, far darker about him. His grin widened as he reached out a long, twisted hand, his long fingers stretching toward me. "Do you feel it now?" His voice echoed inside my head. "This train doesn't stop for the living." Panic surged through me. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. But as I turned to run, the train jolted again, harder than before, and the figure suddenly vanished. The carriage fell silent once more. The passengers remained motionless, eyes still turned toward me. I was alone now. Or so I thought. But I knew it wasn't over. Whatever this was, it was still with me, and the worst was yet to come. The train finally came to a stop, jolting gently, but it felt different this time. I stumbled off onto a deserted platform, disoriented and gasping for air. The station was eerily silent, the air cold and still. No one else was there, only darkness stretching out in every direction. I looked round, hoping to find some sign of where I was, but there was nothing. Just empty tracks and lifeless surroundings. My phone had no signal, and my watch had stopped at midnight. I felt a growing sense of dread, as though I had been left in a place far from any reality I knew. Then I heard it again, the same voice, low and distant, but unmistakably clear. "Do you know where this train is going?" I turned, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Only shadows, whispering faintly in the wind. Was I truly alone? Or had I boarded something far darker than I could comprehend? To this day, I'm not sure what happened. But I know one thing. Those passengers, that train, they never stopped haunting me. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the distant sound of a train's whistle, calling for someone somewhere in the darkness. It might be calling for me.